What's up, nerds? Alright, before you click away in utter disgust at looking at this video, just let's go through the demo and see what this video is all about. So we have a web app with 3 APIs that have been authenticated with OAuth2 authentication. So you can already see our get users, which runs every 3 seconds, is throwing a 401 unauthorized. If we try to create a new user with this button, it says unauthorized. If we try to delete a user, it says unauthorized. So we have protected these APIs. Now what you can see here is a sign in with Google button with one of my Gmails. So I'm going to click this, and all of a sudden you see that my information is populated. You got a message that said create new user, and look, the get users API works. You're no longer getting this unauthenticated 401 error. If we try to create a new user, we can. There it is. And if we try and disable this user, we can, because now we're authenticated, which is really cool. You can even double check this in the database. All of a sudden, we have 2 users, one enabled, one disabled, and more specifically, my Gmail. So that's really cool. What else can we do? Well, I can actually disable this new user that we created, and if I try to sign in again, it will re-enable me, and it says re-enable existing user, and there I am. So that's the demo. It's OAuth Spring Security, OAuth Authentication, OAuth2 with JSON Web Tokens. And what we're going to do is we configured Spring Security to use OAuth2 and JWTs to authorize our APIs. We generate a valid JWT token using Google Sign-In, and then we integrate that Google Sign-In button with Angular. So the code review objectives: secure our APIs by requiring OAuth2 and JWT authentication, implement Google's social sign-on into our Angular front end, create or re-enable a user using a successful Google sign-on JWT, and then access the APIs requiring authentication using that Google JWT. So how did we do this? First, we had to set up OAuth2 and JWT authentication in our backend. So the first thing that we did was update our POM. We removed Spring Boot Starter Security, and we replaced it with Spring Boot Starter OAuth2 Resource Server. So we have turned our application into a resource server that requires OAuth2 authentication. So we've added this dependency, and then we reconfigure our security filter chain. And so this is the order, this is the filter that everything goes through. And we start with CORS, and this is just to enable cross-origin requests. We have CSRF, which is disabled. I've gone over this in other videos, but if you don't disable this, only GET requests will work unless you have a CSRF token, which I'm not using here. So we disable it so our POST and our PUTs work. And then we authorize our specific HTTP requests. So what I've done a little bit different is followed a best practice, which is deny all requests at the very end. So if this is all we have, this is a blanket deny, which is any controller we make will always be denied no matter what you have. Whether you have a valid password or a valid JWT, doesn't matter, we're denying everything. So we end with this, which means everything before it will be allowed. The first one up here, this line, is our health check. It's our actuator, and we're saying permit all GET requests that hit our actuator endpoint. Permit them all. They don't need authentication. Don't worry about it. But all GET, POST, and PUTs that match our API v1 endpoint, those all require authentication. And the authentication we're requiring is the OAuth2 resource server, JWT, JSON Web Token, with defaults. And down here, we have registered a bean, which will be injected. And we're saying the decoder that you're going to use to decode the JWT, the issuing location is accounts.google.com. And how I got this was I knew I wanted to use Google, and so I got my hands on a Google Web Token, and I would just went to JWT.io, and when you paste in the JWT here, it'll show you the ISS, the issuer over here. And so if you're using Microsoft, whatever you're using, just get your hands on a JWT that the social sign-in produces, and then just pull out the ISS here, and you can register it here. But that's all we really had to do on the back end was update our POM and then get our security filter chain set up correctly. And then I did change some code here that I'll include, which is the WebMvcConfig.java file. So previously I had been marking with an annotation cross origin to enable CORS for our controllers, but I prefer to just do it from a central single file. So I have set up a CORS mapping here, which is, I just have my allowed origin of localhost and my allowed methods and my headers for all of my different API patterns. And so I've just moved everything here because in my user controller, you may or may not remember, I used to have a cross origin tag that I just don't want to have to manage it like that. I'd rather manage it from the configuration. But I did say this isn't technically needed for authorization. It's just a change I made in this code base. So that's the back end. Actually pretty straightforward once you know what you're doing. So let's go to the front end. So the first thing that we did was add the social sign-on to our package.json. Some group of people, they're lovely. They have this social sign-on. I just added it to the package.json, social sign-in right there. And then I had to get an OAuth client ID for the registration from the Google Cloud Console. So you can get your own. They don't need to be secret. Go to APIs and services, credentials, create new credentials, go through the process. OAuth client ID, it's a web app, create it, and it will give you basically the one value you need, this Google login provider ID, it's called a client ID, whatever. You provide that here in the social auth service configuration in our app.config. It's a provider, and that's really all you need to do in terms of external stuff. Once you've added the package and you've configured the package, you can just add the sign-in button directive, and we'd add this to our Authentication Dashboard. So this dashboard has our create user button, it has our view users table, it has our delete users form. Just to show off, I have the user.photo here, I have the user.name that we include when the user is populated, but I just added the ASL Google sign-in button using like the default look and feel. So I added that directive to the dashboard, which is what you see here. And then we subscribe to the auth service.auth state. All this is documented very easily in the GitHub, the repo for the package. So I'm just kind of summarizing it. But in the actual TS file, in the ng init, we just have this auth service, which is the social auth service. We subscribe to the auth state, and it sends a user. The user is a social user. So you get the ID, the email, the name, the photo URL. What I want here is the ID token. That's the JWT for Google. And basically, what we end up doing is when this user changes, whether it changes to null or it changes to a valid user, we save the ID token to using this JWT service. So when a Google sign-on is successful, the JWT user ID token will be populated. We've created a JWT service to actually save and manage that token locally. So if we go here to JWT service, we have three methods that we created: get token, save token, destroy token. save token will save in the Chrome in your browser and local storage. It will save the actual token value. Get token will retrieve that stored value from your local storage, and destroy it will destroy that value from your local storage. So when we subscribe to the user, we save the token that we get in the browser locally so that we have access to it. Some short-term persistent storage. It's all local. I never actually, we're not storing this or hard coding this anywhere in the back end. And so once we have gotten the token, we've signed in, we've put it in the browser, we create a new JWT token auth interceptor. So in a previous, the last episode of this episode before, we created the basic auth interceptor, where this is where we added the authorization header basic with our username and password with base64 encoding to every request going out. That's what an interceptor does. Well, same exact principle. We added the content type and the accept headers, but ultimately we just have this authorization header, and we have bearer, and then we have that JWT token as a string. And so we have this new interceptor. In the app config, we have provide HTTP client with interceptors, and we say use the JWT token auth interceptor. So now every request that we make from the front end will add, if it's there, the JWT token to the authorization bearer header. So we're just doing what we would do with a curl request with TypeScript with Angular. So that's how we've gone from, this is the package, we've configured the package, we've added it, we've gotten access to that value, we've persisted that value locally, and now we include that value with every request so that it's part of our API requests, and the backend has access to our JWT. So now that the backend is getting the authorization from the front end, we needed to have a create Google user post API. So go back to the backend. We have the user controller. We want to create a user when we get a valid JWT token from Google sign-on. So we create it under API v1 users. We add create Google endpoint. It's a post, produces application.json, and it creates a Google user. So now that we've added the resource server POM and the security config, and we have our security here, we have access to the security context holder. So instead of sending the JWT in the body or as a request parameter, it's already available, that the interceptor has made it available in the request. So it's in the request itself. So we have the security context holder, we get the context, we get the authentication, we cast it to the type JWT authentication token because this is the type it is. We're just making the code base aware. We're getting back a JWT authentication token. And then we actually pull out that bearer value by just calling get token and get token value. So this is how we are just pulling from the request what that token value is. And then Google provides some Java code to validate a Google Auth token. So we pass that token that we've pulled from the request, and we're verifying it, and it returns an optional user. And this user is just the user entity that we created before. This is our user, it's our user entity. And so we verify the JWT token. We use the client ID again, the same one as the front end. But we verify this token, and we pull out, whatever information we can from it, the email, the name, the picture, the locale, the family name, the given name, and we just use a simple Java constructor to create a new user. Created a constructor here, but it just takes the first name, the last name, and the username, and we use the email, the Gmail in this case, as the username, and we set it enabled as true. So we create this new user entity, and we return an optional of user. If this validation fails and the user is empty, we just throw an error and we say we failed to validate via JWT and we stop there. Otherwise, we get a user back. Then we have to check, is that user that we've created, are they already a user? So we find by username, which is the Gmail, and if is already a user is present, then we get that user, we get the optional, we have an existing user, we set enabled as true, and then we save and flush that existing user, which will re-enable the existing user. They could already be enabled, doesn't matter, we've re-enabled them. If they aren't already a user, there's no username matching the one that we've created, then we just save and flush the user and we say created new user. Boom. So that's all we really have to do on the back end. It's very simple, very clean. So that's the back end create Google user post API. The front end needs to call this. So like we said, we have this ng-init which subscribes to the user. We've talked about how we save that JWT token. When the user is not null, we call this authentication core service. So the core service we've injected, we added a create Google user method. And this does nothing really. I mean, it just does exactly what we said it was. It sends a post request, doesn't include anything else because the bearer token is already controlled by the interceptor that we created. And it just hits that, users create Google for the V1 API, app version, API URL. So you just hit it and then we return the response as an observable. So like we do all the time, we set the response equal to an observable of a string, and then we use the async pipe to unpack it here and subscribe to it and unsubscribe to it for us so that when the message comes back, it'll be populated here and it'll tell us what it did. Created a user, it re-enabled a user, or it failed. And so you have your back end and then you have your front end, and we made sure that we call this function when the user is not null. And then you are then able to access the APIs requiring authentication. So before we signed in with Google, you saw they were all 401 unauthenticated. Couldn't create, couldn't get, couldn't delete. But after we signed in, not only was our username there, our user was created, but all of the buttons were and all the APIs we could use, because we didn't have any role-based protections, but we were sending through the authentication that was valid. So just a demo, it still works. Everything's kind of being loaded. Create new user. Create a new user works. It shows up. But if you wanted to show that, like, I could actually destroy the token here, it'll save and reload. And now everything's unauthorized again because we've cleared that token. So going full circle, that's what we've done. That's the code. I mean, if we wanted to run through it, I updated the get ignore, nothing there. Updated the docs, of course. The package.json, I told you we just needed that new package. The app config is where we configured the social auth service, which is boilerplate except for the provider ID that I got. And then we wired in the new auth interceptor there, replaced the HTTP basic one from a previous demo. We have the Authentication Dashboard component. I showed you that. That's just when we added the Google sign-in button. We added the ng-init where we handle the user that we get back, and we call we call create Google user. We went through all this. Nothing there. Nothing there of note. This is our new interceptor. We have the application core service, so I just hard-coded nothing here. I just hard-coded the URL to get it working. Create Google user, showed you that. JWT service, showed you that. Registered in the environment, the new path, showed you that. Just did some env stuff. Docker compose. Yeah, I just had to inject the environment variable there. Told you what, we went from security to OAuth resource server. SecurityConfig.java. So yeah, we just went from the HTTP basic to OAuth2, got a little fancier and a little bit better, more secure with how we were handling things there, added the decoder that we needed. WebMvc, this is just sending all of our CORS into one central config file. I removed the username and password because that's not what we're doing anymore. We're not on HTTP basic. I added the dependency. So this is how we validate the Google JWT token. They told you, they gave me the code. Docs are online. I just copied it pretty much exactly. Like I said, I got rid of the cross origin in favor of the config file. And then I set up the create Google API, which I showed you. I validated the Google Auth token. User entity, I just created a new constructor as I showed you, and then I created a toString method for some debugging later. And yeah, I just added in the POM, what is this? Just a version update to manage centrally. So that's it. If you made it this far, which I doubt anybody has, like, subscribe. It helps, kind of motivates me. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope all this mini-series has been helpful. And what we're going to do next is add roles. So when I log in, I'll be a regular user, but then we'll have admins, and admins can use something and regular users can't. It'll be pretty cool. So thanks. Bye.